My father was an immigrant who, of course, loved and believed in America. He came young enough in 1933, 2 years after the building of the Empire State Building, so that he did not speak with an accent and, like many immigrants, especially those coming from hardship, never spoke of where he came from. On my mother's side, my grandparents were also immigrants who also loved America. Had they all stayed in Europe, the chances are overwhelming that they would not have survived, and I would never have been born. My wife is also the descendant of immigrants, on her father's side from Jamestown, 1600s. They were also pioneers, settling in the Pacific Northwest as far back as the late 1800s. On her mother's side, they were Irish Protestants and German Jews, all moving west and further west. I was brought up in the village of Dobbs Ferry, about 20 miles north of New York City, across the Hudson River from the Palisades. I have left and returned many times to the village and the city and the river. This is a farm that my parents purchased about 50 years ago and where I lived for a while after I graduated from college. It lies outside of the town of Catskill, New York. The stone house was built in 1791. When we returned to America 20 years ago, after living in Israel for a long time, we lived in an apartment in the Red Barn and set up a studio in another part of the barn. The farm lies on the Hudson. The river, the valley, and the Catskills are the birthplace of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, from which painters then went out to explore the continent and the whole world.
In between. There is a place in between, a glance around, a breath taken in a moment. The question is out. Where am I now? Where have I been? Halfway point, I would say. How fast it flew. A reassembling is needed, a looking forth. Courage must displace enthusiasm of youth. Wisdom must compensate as the leaves drop in the fall, turning red. In transition, so life is given the opportunity to fulfill its call. There is a winter of watching and waiting before spring and new life bursts into green.
And so we left the town of Catskill to strike out on our own, heading west through the little mountain towns in a U-Haul truck. We heard on the radio that John Kennedy's plane was missing. It was 1998, the end of an era. And this is where we arrived, 1754 Pacific Drive, Camano Island, Washington. It was the only house for sale with owner financing, and we had been out of the country so long that we had no credit record. The realtor drove us 17 miles to the end of the island, to the end of the world it seemed, until we saw this view.
Living incognito on our Isle of Bliss, leaving all the world behind. Can't it be like this? The tide goes out and the tide comes in. Apple tree blossoms and the summer begins. That's life in the story with you, baby. That's life.
From Camano Island, we began a series of excursions by road and by foot throughout the Pacific Northwest and down the coast, all the way to Tijuana. We learned from a geology professor that parts of the landmass had docked onto North America from the sea, and this influenced the Asian style in many of the compositions.
Ode to Deception Pass. Gray mists of pearly clouds meet the swimming whales. Swirling tides of rushing water ebb and flow around my heart. As I stare into the narrow passage between Puget Sound and the Straits of Juan de Fuca, my spirit casts out far beyond this end of the Earth Isle, through whirlpools and kelp beds, wondering if these same waters reach the shores of Ashkelon on the Mediterranean, this other far-off home. We live there and here, stretched between two harbors, like sailboats rising and falling on wind-catching waves. Our little ships tack back and forth through the passages and shoals of inner and outer waters. What great portents and adventures lay ahead, like curious eyes peeking. We plot the next journeys around the far horizon.
If a nation has a soul, or to put it in other terms, a character, then the landscape plays a large part and should be cherished. But the other part of what constitutes a country is community. In our travels and in our settling down, we have been fortunate to find a renewed sense of community, not that it has ever really been lost. Rivers and springs. In a land divided by rivers we traveled, sometimes floating on waters named with the Indian names in languages lost or nearly lost, an entire continent tamed. Starting in Arapika, Seminole for bird, drifting down the Weeki Wachee, meaning little spring or winding river, we followed the mermaid manatee. Homosassa, the place of many pepper plants in the tongue of the native creek. Flamingo, pelican, anaheim, and 3 snowy egrets reflected in a pool, lifted out of a Chinese scroll white as snow and wings like lace, as delicate as a porcelain bowl. America is an odyssey, and like all odysseys, it's more about the journey than the destination. Even as we race to the future, there are pockets of traditional culture full of local color. It's a journey through time as well as space. These figures drifting with the tide could be Huck and Jim, but time, like a river, flows onward, not backward. We returned to America at the turn of the millennium. We were fortunate to have the opportunity to return to familiar places of our childhood and youth, and to explore new territory as well. Our journey has not been exhaustive but personal as we meet old friends and new.